recording just so that we have this. Hi, everybody. This is Daniela.
Wonderful.
She's going to be talking all about festivals and finding the right festival and all that stuff. So we're very excited to have you. Yeah, if you need anything, I'll be here. But otherwise, all you.
I get to take the reins. Wonderful. Cool. All right. Well, so for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a literary manager with Circle Confusion. I've been with the company since 2013. I started up on the production side, and then in 2016 made the transition to the manager track. I identify young up-and-coming writers, and I judge competitions and attend festivals. So, I think that there is this sort of like looming question. Every writer sort of has a budget about how they're thinking about spending their money for submissions and even attending festivals. It is not cheap and it is not free. And so I hope that this is a good opportunity to just better understand sort of like the kind of economy and the purpose behind these festivals. And I keep saying competitions because competitions are a part of festivals now, and I think the Austin Film Festival might be the prime example of that. In that people who submit to the Austin Film Festival's competitions can attend, but festivals like, today, Sunday, January 21st, currently the Sundance Film Festival is happening. And so often writers are like, well, Sundance is this, incredible festival that seems to be the buzz of Hollywood. How do I, as a young up and coming writer, participate in the festival? And so I think that's why I want to differentiate, because the Sundance Film Festival is really an opportunity for young filmmakers. So if you're a writer who doesn't want to direct, it doesn't really serve that full purpose. And there are labs under the Sundance Film Festival that exist to sort of help curate a small group of people that they will eventually feed into the Sundance Film Festival once there's a finished product. The same thing with Tribeca and South by Southwest, and there are lists that Roadmap Writers has of these festivals that exist. That serve that same purpose of like the finished product of a film that has, it's done, it's been cast, it's been in post-production, and this is an opportunity to distribute it. And so, the Venice Film Festival and the Cannes Film Festival have that. So that's sort of the difference. And the contests and the competitions, I think, are an opportunity to not only expose yourself to judges and expose yourself to sort of like the process of being assessed by professional readers, but it also, if you have the privilege of attending, lets you network beyond your current network and lets you attend panels that can educate you. So it can work twofold as like a practice for yourself and creating your own deadlines, but in an extension, it helps you sort of educate and, just be able to see sort of the success stories for writers. And so the submission process, I myself am not too familiar with what it's like, other than it's nerve-wracking. Some of my clients still submit to competitions and to festivals in order to qualify. I would say that if you don't have representation, it is the prime way for you to get people to read you without submitting blindly. Yeah, I think like that's essentially like where I sort of like you should ask yourself the question as to, why am I spending money and submitting? And what do I hope to gain from this? So there's a question that was asked of like, what's your philosophy on resubmitting? I think, you should be very careful, right? Your script has been submitted once and has been read and assessed. And if it didn't place or didn't have the result that you would have hoped for, a resubmission of that same script to that same festival, even if it's a different version of what you've already written or a revised version, I would be careful to assume that it's so much that more improved that you will get the attention of someone that might have previously been exposed to it. But if it's a significant difference and you feel like I have improved as a writer, then take the risk. But the economy of it, of like, okay, it costs money to submit to these festivals, you should just then consider like, all right, maybe if I'm going to spend money and take this risk, how about I better my odds with a new sample and maybe something else. So I hope that answers your question. Perfect. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, we talk about sort of like buzzy samples and sort of what kind of catches the attention, and the samples tend to fall under all these different categories. I always recommend to writers, if they're submitting to these festivals, that they should, before they submit or before they've ever conjured up an idea, educate themselves on what's been placed before. That can be a good determiner in terms of what the sort of what's in the zeitgeist and what is popular. And if you're able to have access to those scripts, I recommend you read them. You know, what makes a great reader makes a great writer, funny Freudian slip, but what makes a great writer is also a great reader, someone who's exposed themselves to the craft and exposed to themselves to things that are receiving great reviews. It's not to be like, oh, this is the template of success, but it helps you determine or like better understand what's in the mind of the reader. You know, as a manager, I'm asked on like a daily basis to read maybe 5 to 10 scripts. So like in a weekend, I have to get through 25 just to stay sane. And it can be very trying with certain types of scripts that are heavily described or feel very prose heavy. And it gives me the inclination that a writer hasn't exposed themselves to reading a lot of scripts. Because there's sort of this succinct nature of like how you can explain narrative, and knowing that you're writing it for the screen and knowing that you're writing it for a reader. So just things to keep in mind as you're considering film festivals and considering the opportunities available to you. I think that pretty much covers sort of like the general overview of like the attitudes towards these film festivals. I would say, you know, do your homework beforehand, looking to see if these festivals have a specific niche, and thinking like, okay, am I a fan of this programming? Oftentimes it's just like, oh, I love the buzzy name of like, I want to enter the Sundance Labs to see whether I can then eventually have a finished screenplay at Sundance. But if you're very niche and specific, I very rarely have seen Sundance program, you know, like heavy horror. But the Fantastic Film Festival is a horror specific festival. So it's just a matter of doing your homework and sort of just better understanding like where you can fall in, because that means that the people who are judging and attending those festivals are gonna share your sort of like agenda and like convictions as a writer. I'm trying to think if there's anything else or if there are any other questions. I will say, as someone who's participated at festivals as a panelist, there's certain things, maybe recommendations. So if you're planning on attending a panel or attending a festival and attending a panel and wanting to have access to the panelists after the fact, it can be a swarm. I'm speaking from a personal experience that I had at the Austin Film Festival, whereby after one of the panels I participated in, one of the writers followed me back to my hotel thinking that that was an appropriate thing to do. In the same way, it's just a matter of thinking that this is a social profession as much as it might be a isolated one. I know that's sort of a contradiction to say, but you're isolated in the experience of writing, but it's social when you have to promote your own work. And it's social when once your work has been exposed to have general meetings. So first impressions are very important. And if you want to attend a panel, and it's a very brave thing, I acknowledge it's not easy to approach someone and say, I have a piece of material that I would very much like you to read. Be personal about it, personalize the experience, and be, you know, if it's like, Daniela, like, I admire that you spoke specifically about this point, and I have a piece of material that I think might speak to you. What is the best way? And not feeling sort of entitled to that experience of, you owe me this read, or you owe me your time, because it can come off in a very negative light. And so that person who followed me, I think, just made a lot of assumptions that it would be a comfortable experience for me, and it wasn't. And it was unfortunate because as this person was pitching to me their idea, I started to feel like, wow, this would have been a good idea, but it just didn't come off the right way. So just sort of things to keep in mind. So here's an additional question. I just like that you guys are being very proactive. Please don't be shy. I want to help you and personalize these answers. So let me just give me a second as I read this. Let's say that you submit to a contest and order feedback. If you don't place in the contest, but your feedback is super positive, what do you do? How do you process that information, and what do you do with it? Or what if you place in the contest, but your feedback is not favorable? What do you do? Okay, so the feedback thing. Feedback is always good because it just helps you as a writer. You're going to welcome feedback no matter what, and no matter what stage you are in your career. Even the people who are professional writers are still getting feedback from producers, from actors, from directors of how to make the story better. So I think you should take it also with a grain of salt. The reality of you not placing in a contest should not be a reflection of whether you think you're the best. It is such a subjective experience. I have signed writers who have not placed, but whose materials I have judged. And it's because I think that they had an incredible talent, and it's a raw talent, and maybe the story wasn't perfect, but sometimes people are assessing of like, oh, is this a movie that I would watch? But as I'm thinking about it, like, is this something that would translate into another idea or a perspective that the writer might have, and why could they sort of flourish in this industry that is really craving individuality? So, you taking the positive feedback and be like, okay, I am a good writer, and maybe I didn't place, but like, use that as fuel to move forward. And know that maybe in reading your feedback that okay, this might appeal to someone. So doing your homework of like, okay, I didn't place, but are there managers, agents, producers who might find this appealing? And use the feedback to promote your work, whether it's in a query letter or whether it's like, it's just a way to personalize it, of promoting yourself. If you have your website or on your Twitter, of like quoting the feedback and being like, this is what someone said. I've seen that before. And I do look at it as a positive sort of the affirmation of what's going on. And you do place in the contest and your feedback is not favorable, people still will look at at the fact that you placed and consider, okay, this is someone who is clearly talented. But I would just say, like, the feedback is coming from a person who has subjective opinions, even if it's supposed to be an objective experience. So don't be too frazzled by it, but you placing can be used to promote yourself as you're looking for representation, or even looking for someone to produce your work. Okay, so here we go. How do you balance not writing for the market and writing for a competition's niche? That's a really good question, because you have to figure out sort of differentiating between writing for the market and writing for a niche. And so when I was talking about the niche, it's like there's going to be a subject matter or a theme that's centralized in a festival. And so going back to Fantastic Fest, it is going to have horror elements. But if your writing is like quirky horror, or, you know, your personal perspective of horror is not necessarily what people might think is marketable, I wouldn't stray away from that, because individualism is celebrated in this industry, and fresh voices and fresh perspectives are celebrated. So look, great work rises to the top even when it's different. And you see that with movies like Looper, and you see that with movies like Arrival, that are taking the conventional and making it unconventional. So you don't have to feel like, oh, I'm just going to write this commercial movie that would feel like a Liam Neeson movie like Taken or The Commuter or whatever. But if you're like, I really want to write an action film for a festival that celebrates action writers and action films, but I want to do it a little bit differently, take the risk. And if it's great, then people will notice. Many agents say they only look at nickels and they ignore all the others. What is your view on that? I think it's a very narrow-minded perspective. The nickels contest is remarkable in so much as, you know, when you look at the people who place, like it's really good writing, and it's people who know the craft. But again, it goes back to the niche of there are some contests that are specific, sort of like have specific needs, and the nickels is sort of just like a blanket of, hey, if you've never made this amount of money, if you've never made X amount of money, then you can submit to this as a competition, and you know, people will read, and then we'll determine if you win a grand prize. But some competitions don't have grand prizes. So I just think that the perspective of, okay, I'm only going to look at this one to determine the quality of the work is narrow-minded, because it's also expensive to submit to those to a lot of competitions, and to choose only one to review, it limits your access to good writers. So, but you know, I just would do your own research, Anthony, as you're thinking about which competitions you're going to submit to, of like who could possibly be reading. Roadmap does a really great job of telling you what companies are looking at the material. And I believe that other companies, you know, strive to do the same, because it also validates like their access in promoting you beyond just, you know, accepting your money and your material. When you're reading a sample, do you prefer something marketable or something that shows who you are? I prefer seeing a piece of work that is showing a perspective and showing you who you are, where I can say that this is a piece of material that only this writer could have ever written. It is just a very special piece of writing, and it's such a personal experience that if, you know, I'm reading scripts blindly sometimes from, you know, potential clients and queries, I really want to be able to get to know that person without ever having a conversation with them, but it's off of the type of story that they tell, because then you can just ask. It encourages and promotes a conversation about the story that then gets to know that person. So, you know, there's a script that was on the blacklist last year called The Great Nothing by Cesar Vitali, and it's just this beautiful, moving story of an unlikely friendship. And immediately I want to ask questions about who this person is, because there are a lot of philosophical ideas and stories, or philosophical ideas and questions about life. And I just want to be like, oh, is this writer a philosophy major? And who are they? And there's certain sort of like dynamics between family that make me beg certain questions. So that to me feels a lot more sort of like a personal experience with a writer than if I just see something that feels just like marketable, you know, found footage movie that we've seen 100 times, because it just doesn't provoke in the same way. Okay, so what contests or festivals are best for comedic screenplays? That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure, like this isn't an exhaustive list, but Austin Film Festival does do a good job of categorizing some of their materials and their submissions process. So they do have like comedy scripts and drama scripts. And when I submitted, or no, when I judged the final draft, they also categorize their submissions into dramas and comedies. I would look to, thinking about where comedians, like, there's like a festival in Edinburgh, but I don't know if they have a script contest, but it sort of becomes like a black hole of looking at like, okay, what's a comedy script that I've read lately? And then who are those writers? What's their history? How did they start? I also think in the world of comedy, it's so much about your community. You look at a lot of these like executive produced by Judd Apatow and, promoted by these different celebrities, that they all come from this small niche. And so if you're a comedy writer and you might live in a town that might have a comedy troupe or an improvisational group, I encourage you to not only think about writing screenplays, but if you can write sketches that then you can post online, like thinking beyond the festival as a place to submit screenplays, but you see these shorts that are comedy shorts. So finding other ways to promote your work and your sense of humor can maybe be advantageous as well. So hopefully that non-answer answers your question. Okay, how do you carry the momentum after you've placed either second rounder, quarterfinalist, or semifinalist? This is a really great question. So you're promoting yourself when you're submitting your material to other people, whether they're producers in the hopes that it'll get produced, or whether it's representation in the hopes of getting representation. I'm not sure sort of where you are in that process and that journey of being a writer. But I would say that when you're sort of engaging in conversations, and, I can admit, like, I have a very short attention span, of leading it with, I placed in this contest as a quarterfinalist or as a semifinalist, and this is the script that I placed off of. It's just a good way, like a promotional thing. And so just use it to your advantage as a point of introduction, but also don't just lean on it as like, this is sort of now what determines my worth. Writers need to be constantly writing. So beyond having just placed, be prepared to talk about the next script that you have that may be placing sometime soon, or like what you're hoping will place, or sort of hoping how that will build off of that momentum. And if in you placing, you have opportunities to participate in events, I highly recommend it if it is something that's available to you, because it is just a great way of networking. Though being placed provides you with the honor of going to certain events, and it helps you meet panelists in person, meet fellow writers, and build out your network. So your MI post-production of first short film, is there a format to put in, especially for electronic submission, that most festivals accept? So I don't fully understand what the question is asking about, sort of like submitting a short film. But as I understand, the submission process for submitting shorts is usually you're posting it to YouTube or Vimeo in a private link and submitting that link with the other instructions to certain festivals. In that process, just making sure that you keep your video private, even if it's in post-production, because there's sometimes some limitations of, if this short has been exposed prior to it being at a festival, the festival will not feel special and being like, oh, we're not premiering this short. They want to feel like they're worthy of the honor of submitting or of distributing this and attracting people to attend their festival because it's the first time that they're able to see it. So I think it's something to keep in mind. There are shorts that are not completed that get submitted to festivals, and festivals are used to that. But the expectation is that if you were to get placed or programmed into the festival, that the finished product would be what they show, not something that's a work in progress. Can I talk about some effective ways to follow up on contacts made at festivals? That bad experience sounds like it was very uncomfortable. What's the right way? Okay, so the festival environment, it's very intimate, where you sometimes see a panelist, like just sort of socializing at a mixer. I attend the mixers that are available that are like writers and panelists, because I think it's a very sort of like calm way, not after a panel and not in the rush of a schedule, to just like have a very personal conversation with a writer. And we're not necessarily like talking about exactly what has been written, but more so about what inspires, why you're there, where you come from. And so that personalizes the experience. Then when later on I get an email that's like, hey, it's so-and-so that we met at such and such event. We shared a bond over Liam Neeson. I have this piece of material that I wanted to expose to you. Are you still comfortable? So it's just kind of the ramping up and follow-up conversation off of something that was personal. So there's that one circumstance. If you can attend a mixer at a film festival and you do your homework, a lot of those film festivals have like small photos attached with the bios of talking to the managers or reps or producers that will sort of share your sort of sensibilities, and then figuring out a way to introduce yourself. It is a very brave thing, but it's also like, we're there to meet people too. We're not there to have an isolated experience. It's an opportunity to meet writers in their element and celebrate storytelling. So that is just a way of like figuring out a point of entry. I find that when there's this rush of people meeting me after a panel, it can be very overwhelming, but it's also hard for me to differentiate who is who. So just keeping that in mind. But if that's your only opportunity, I would just use sort of something that was said in the panel that really spoke to you and be like, well, hopefully we can, connect further on this conversation, because I had a couple of questions. And typically people will be comfortable to, via email, have those conversations, but you just have to be sensitive about how much time are you asking of the other person before you send their material. What genres are succeeding at festivals and writing competitions? And do you have an opinion as to what genres writers should focus on? So this question is kind of tricky, because I am of the personal mindset that you need to write what you are comfortable in, what you love, and what you're good at writing at. No one should ever tell you what you should be writing. It's a very personal thing to write. So that's where it's tricky. That said, we often see genres sort of succeeding at festivals and writing competitions, and they tend to reflect what's succeeding in the marketplace. True stories, biopics, things that feel like a never before seen story tend to be what attracts attention. But as I was saying before, I'm inundated with a flurry of stories, and anything that feels derivative can be off-putting, because it just doesn't feel like there's a sense of urgency. And I think that that's the key word, right? What is the sense of urgency with the story? And that can exist in any genre. It can be, is there a satirical horror that you're looking to tell? And horror is genius because the horror elements elevate the stakes for the characters. It's a very personal narrative about survival. Or with sci-fi, it's the same thing. You're taking a genre spin to tell a story that might feel familiar, but using the unfamiliar, making it feel new and fresh. But biopics can feel predictable, so finding inventive ways to tell them. I, Tanya was very successful in the box office, and that script was very sought after because of the way that that story was told. And so just sort of things to keep in mind as you're considering what genre you want to write in, of asking yourself the question of, am I writing this because I want to write this, or am I writing this because people want to read this? Very quickly, readers will see through whether you're writing for them or you're writing for yourself. And there tends to be a happy marriage when you succeed in pleasing the reader in the experience of writing for yourself as well. As a judge and as a manager, what are you sick of seeing in scripts? Anything from grammatical quirks to themes to certain types of characters. So I just think that the thing that can be exhausting in scripts is when the prose and the action lines are heavily described. It is just it can feel very daunting and feel like work. And more importantly, it makes me think that the writer doesn't have like a clear understanding of what it means to write for the screen, that they don't know like what is important information to convey in order to feel like we get to the point. So that can be frustrating. I think, also as a woman, I can get very frustrated when women are stereotyped, or when a female character is introduced and the only characteristics about her that are specified are her attraction level. It's always like, could be beautiful if she brushed her hair, or, lacks a certain competence or something. And it's just frustrating because I'm just like, women are complex characters, and when men are introduced, it's always like brave or cowardly or something that really helps me dig my teeth a little bit deeper into who that character is. So it's just like, that's something that I'm tired of, because I also think it's just a sort of just, we're far enough along in our storytelling that those characters should feel a little bit deeper in terms of like in substantive. So yeah, a heavy prose. Also, anytime the word wordlessly is used is very frustrating, because if they're doing something wordlessly, then just don't use the word wordless and just describe it in action. It's like, you have a certain economy with words on the page, be smart about it. And then, being able to describe characters in this meaty way, but succinct. So that's why I highly recommend read scripts of movies that you love and see how they describe their characters and how they get their characters across. So is a writer with scripts invited to several smaller festivals of interest to you personally? Or is there a tier or type of festival or competition you consider to be more important than others? I'm very early on in my career, so if I have the honor of being invited to a festival, regardless of what it is, I'm happy to take that opportunity. I like meeting writers from all walks of life, and I find that if I'm going to go to the Omaha Film Festival, I'm going to meet a very different type of person than if I were to go to the Austin Film Festival, which is a larger festival. So it's just stuff that I keep in mind of like, okay, this might attract different types of writers, and also it can be expensive to stay in Austin versus staying in Omaha, so it can attract different types of people that I might not be exposed to. So smaller festivals also appeal to me because it's a more intimate experience. I had the pleasure a few years ago to go to the Nashville Writers Conference, and the way it was set up, it was, really great to meet writers on a personal level. And there was no barrier between Hollywood and the locals. So it's just nice and a breath of fresh air to be reminded of, like, this is a community that is symbiotic. I'm also not in the position to be picky about the types of festivals and competitions that I assess. But I think in the competition realm, I have, after sort of judging certain contests, felt that maybe on an organizational level, like I didn't like the experience of the way the contest was being handled, that I didn't want to participate again. But again, it's like great scripts rise to the top. So I don't want to overlook a certain competition because who knows what, rare gem might have submitted at that point. So it's just, my job is only secured by finding good material. And so I'm going to find them in every place. No stone will go unturned. What is your opinion on submitting more than one script to the same contest? That's actually a really good question. Because I just assume like the starving artist, like some people might not be able to afford submitting multiple scripts. I would say, in doing that, you might maybe you might rob someone else of an opportunity of getting placed if you're privileged enough and a great enough writer that you have placed multiple of your own scripts. I've never seen that before. But if I'm looking at the competitions and festivals and looking for potential clients to represent, I would want one script to be submitted, because it would say to me that that writer knows what at that point in time in their career is the best example of their writing. But granted, if you're submitting more than one script to the same contest in the hopes that it might get produced, then you could argue the other way, that this is not about seeking out representation, but more about exposing a potential story that might appeal to someone to then get made. So it's, again, just asking yourself the question of like, why am I submitting and what am I hoping to achieve? As a representative, I'm just coming from the school of thought that your submission is a reflection of you considering it your best piece of work. And so just doing one makes me go, okay, this person has a good sense of self. Oh, I did answer this question about the genre succeeding at festivals and writing competitions. So I'll mark that as done. What contests does the industry pay attention to? This is a tough one because, earlier there was a question about like agents say that they only care about nickels. But it's also good to do your homework about looking at festivals and contests, that have been around for a very long time and that are reputable. So, Final Draft has their big break. The tracking board has the Launchpad competitions. There's Nichols. There are also, smaller sort of competitions that people might not know of, but if they're organized enough and have great networking, then they have connections to Hollywood. The Nashville Writers Conference that I attended 2 years ago didn't have very, a lot of promotion. I had never heard of it when I attended, but the quality of the scripts were really great. So now I'm paying close attention when they hold their next contest to make sure. So just in due time. But if you're following Deadline and The Hollywood Reporter and looking at sort of where people are signing, I would also see, if you can look up the name of an agency like Verve and put that in Google and then add like judging contests, and maybe that can generate a couple of other results beyond the ones that I mentioned. When I think of a short in my mind, how many pages on average would the length of one be? I would say the maximum length for a good short would be about 18 to 19 pages, depending on the genre. Because if it's very action heavy, it's probably going to end up being around 22 minutes. And if it's dialogue heavy, it might be a little bit shorter. I recently found out that the Oscar qualifications for Best Short can be up to 40 minutes. But in terms of a short screenplay, as you're submitting it, there's sort of something to be said about a story that can be told succinctly. So leaning on the, 20-minute side versus 40-minute side. So hopefully that answers that question. In those questions, bringing up shorts and bringing up that submission process for shorts, I really I'm a firm believer that a strong short that is produced or even a script can get you a long way. I have had clients who have had their material featured on Vimeo Short of the Week. And it's just, going back to what I was joking about earlier, where we sort of, as people in Hollywood, might have short attention spans in between meetings or sometime in the afternoon, if you want a 5-10 minute break from reading a script or from doing a couple of phone calls, a short that's a strong short can be a really great way to grab attention. And it just is a reflection of executing your craft in a very succinct way of telling a story. And it also can act as underlying material. There are some movies that are based on shorts. And so just thinking to yourself of this could be expanded beyond this. I recently watched the movie Hello, My Name is Doris, which was just a true delight and a special movie. And the fact that it got made is very comforting because it's just silly and eccentric. It's Sally Fields as an older woman wrestling with death of her mother, and she works at an ad company, and this young man played by Max Greenfield starts work at the company, and she ends up having a crush on him, and she's just very eccentric and a lot older than him and is not sure what will come of it. But it was based on a short, which I didn't know, and I think might probably be the reason, and this is an assumption, that maybe built out that movie. So just food for thought as you're thinking about how you're going to use your time and how you're going to promote yourself. If you have the resources to make a short, and if you're more of a writer but have a relationship with a director, take advantage, collaborate. It's a great way to just practice from that experience too of what it means to put something into production. If a contest rules say that your project cannot be optioned or sold while it's a contender in that contest and the entry period lasts more than a few months, should that affect the writer's decision to enter that contest? I would ask yourself the question of whether you believe you're going to get an option from another source before submitting to a contest, because you don't want to cut yourself short in terms of, you have an opportunity, but you also want to submit to this. It can be challenging. But if you're in placing in this contest or exposing my material in this contest, I will get an option, then, I would wait. And I would also see if that contest would yield more potential suitors for your project. So just a matter of asking yourself the question of does this piece of material have an opportunity now, or will it have a better chance later on as you're exposing it to potential producers and even representation, because as representatives, that's our job of finding an opportunity to find people who are going to finance something. So just, it is a personal preference for you and also the people involved if you have producers that are expressing interest. But maybe it'll yield a competitive situation, and then you'll be in a privileged position to choose the person who will option or produce your project. Yes. Come on, guys, more questions. I like the question, sort of the personalization and of the questions and making sure that I can answer them. And even if there are certain things that I said that weren't clear or want me to expand on, feel free to ask follow-up questions. But in thinking, I just keep thinking anecdotes can sort of help inspire and remind you that like there's hope out there, the power of storytelling. So yeah, the Nashville Writers Conference, I was sitting next to a young gentleman who was just talking to me about where he was from and the kind of stories that he likes to tell. And then he asked me if we could get a follow-up coffee when we were back in LA. And so when he got coffee again, he expanded more on the kind of material that he likes to write and the script specifically that he wanted me to read. And it was off of that script that I signed him. So it's okay if you live in LA to just ask and see if the representative or the person you're talking to is comfortable with that. And if the person is based in New York or in a city where you're not from, just think to yourself like, that if you have specific questions or things you want to talk about, that you can ask yourself, okay, like, is this something that I'm willing and comfortable to ask that person to take time out of their day? But then it personalizes the experience. So once you become more friendly, asking them to read your script can maybe yield positive results, or it's just much more of a personal experience than just sending it to a contest and hoping that a judge will fall in love with it. So Kevin asks, were there any scripts you read in the past few years you liked and then went on to be produced? Also, do readers at festivals think about the budget of a script would need to be produced and the overall marketability of the film? As a reader on my end, as a manager, I'm not too concerned about budget and concerned too much about marketability. If it is what seems like a commercial film, yes, marketability is going to be a factor of like, okay, this is a great sample, but could this get made and could I sell it? Because, my job is being a salesman of the material that I represent. There are readers who are producers, so they are thinking about the budget and they are thinking about the marketability of the script. It goes back to the thing I'm going to keep repeating is when you're submitting to a contest, you're asking yourself, and you need to ask yourself, why am I submitting this? If you're submitting it in the hopes that it's going to get produced, then these are factors you need to put into account. Then again, if you write something without budget constrictions in mind and someone loves the story enough, they might say, hey, we really like this, but we need to do a revision or a rewrite to reflect a budget that seems a little bit more manageable. So that's not unheard of. It happens all the time. But I would just say, write the story that's going to service, or write with a budget in mind that's going to service the story, and don't think too much about constrictions because it'll show in the writing. Have I read any scripts in the past few years that I liked, and then it went on to be produced? The script that I'm thinking of right now wasn't one that was submitted to a festival, but I'm a very big fan of Alex Garland, who wrote and directed Ex Machina. And when I saw that I could get a copy of his script Annihilation, I read it, and then I read it as a result of seeing press about the casting. And now it's really cool to see that this, female-driven sci-fi story is coming out in a couple of weeks. And so when the trailer came out, it's just really cool to just see how that was realized. Another script that I read, and I don't represent this writer, Lee Stobie does, and I applaud him because this is an amazing find. Isaac Adamson wrote, I think that's his name, and I apologize if it's not. He wrote the script called Bubbles, which is a Michael Jackson biopic told from the perspective of his chimpanzee Bubbles, and Dan Harmon is producing that. So it's just really cool to read great scripts that are inventive and fresh, and then knowing that Hollywood is reacting well to them and wanting to see them get made. What contest do I specifically advise my clients to enter? It's funny because I don't necessarily recommend my clients enter competitions, because my assumption is they enter contests to seek out representation. But I've had clients express interest in submitting to Nichols and Austin as just a means to, get feedback or be placed, and with Nichols to win a bunch of money. So I just ask them why they want to do it, and I'm there to support them. In the experience with one particular client who's writing for the Nichols Fellowship, it was very difficult because it was an arbitrary deadline, and the script that was submitted wasn't something that I was personally fond of, and that I didn't think it was ready to be exposed. And as a result, like, it didn't place. And it was something where, like, as a representative for a writer, it's my responsibility to make sure that whatever goes out is the best that it can be. And so, it can be a sort of trying conversation with a client who is keen on submitting, but knowing that they have another person that's in their corner, that's supportive of them, but also that they want to keep their best interests in mind. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but I personally am not one that's like, here are the 10 festivals and contests you need to submit to. I let the client decide if it's something they want to focus on. What is the general price range of most contests? What is too much and what is about right? I don't know exact numbers. I will say that when you're starting to hit triple digits, it might be a little bit too much money, like $100, $150, $175. Like, that feels like a lot of money to submit to a contest. A lot of websites have early bird submissions and just promotional discounts. And so before you submit, see if you can find contests that will give you a discount. So instead of paying like $95, you're paying $75. 50 to 75 feels like a good number. And that's something to also keep in mind of, like, writing for a deadline. It's a good way to track, but if you can write with a deadline and consider the amount of money you're submitting it for, make sure you're just submitting the best piece of material and that it's in the best place. So if you're like, oh, I can save $15 and submit it next week, but I could really use the extra 6 weeks, take the extra 6 weeks, because what you don't want is regretting and feeling like you wasted your money. If you have a producer or two interested in your script and you have no representation, what do you recommend as far as strategy for getting one? If a producer or two is interested in your material and there's someone who works actively in Hollywood, I would politely ask the people interested in your scripts if they know representatives that would want to read the material. As a rep, I look very seriously to my colleagues in the industry as to what they're working on and who they're working with. Oftentimes they're working with people that don't have representation. And so I'm always curious if that's the writer's choice or if it's something that the writer's never considered. So see if you can ask the producers. And if they're not comfortable doing that, you can maybe ask them why. And if you don't have that shorthand, just then when you start submitting your material, if you're the kind of person that wants to submit blindly unsolicited material to representatives, include the names of the producers. Like, I have interest of person X and person Y in this piece of material. I'm currently looking for representation so that I can make the right decision. And this is the logline for my script. Don't assume that that person wants to represent you and that they need to represent you because you're doing this deal, or, because you're considering two producers. That's very short-sighted. You need to look for a representative who's there for your career and not just on a project-specific basis, because that's going to yield the strongest relationship for you and the quality foundation for a long-term career. Marnie asks what contests are best for animation. And I don't know the specific answer to that, but this is what I would do. Like, if I had more time and I could just Google and go through the process, I would just explain my process of how I would figure this out. Recently the Student Academy Awards for animation were released, and you're seeing these like animated shorts that have been produced, right? So if we're talking about a script for animation, I would look to festivals that promote content that are kid and family friendly. That would be my first go ahead of like, okay, what's a festival that promotes this? I would also see if, animation companies like Disney and like Sony Animation, Paramount Animation, if they judge or participate in any type of contests as judges or as with their prizes. I think that that's going to be a great way to determine, okay, this is my target audience. I, excuse me, I have cotton mouth. Okay, I want someone from Disney to read my script. I want to submit this to a contest that maybe someone from Disney will read. So it's just sort of like the reverse engineering and the research that goes into that. So I can't give you specifics, but I think that that will be a good way to go forward. I will say in my experience, I'm not seeing a lot of sort of like kid family friendly, or even if this is adult animation specific screenplay contests. So feels like a good idea to keep in the back of my head, because it's definitely something that people are craving to do. Could I summarize the tone of a couple of your favorite contests? Maybe this is one is very independent movie flavored and this one is more mainstream. Ooh, this is good. So like Roadmap Writers has a competition with Route One, like a partnership, and I like those scripts a lot because I'm familiar with the Route One movies, and there's a sense of individualism when it comes to the stories that they're submitting, but it's also with the eye for production. So I do like sort of the tonality and the purposefulness of those scripts that are being submitted to them. I think that the Austin Film Festival attracts a lot of great drama scripts in their drama category, and in their comedy space, they also attract a very sort of eclectic group of comedy writers. And when I say eclectic, it's because of the sensibilities. So it's really great to look at that pool and say, oh, look, I can see different types of senses of humor in this. And the Sundance Labs, when they announce the people who have who are fortunate enough to participate in their labs, those are going to be more like independent movie flavored. A lot of the times those writers already have representation, but it's just something that I always keep in mind because sometimes they don't. So yeah, I would say the Launchpad has a great group also of inventive ideas. I think that whenever I see their top 75, it's just promoting, writers that are having fun with the stories that they're telling. So it's not mainstream and it's not independent movie flavored, but I think it's like voice driven. As a reader and judge in festivals and contests, are there any you have seen go on to be produced? I already answered this question. Actually, no, I haven't yet in the 3 years that I have judged contests seen something go on to be produced, but it's also because it takes a very long time for things to get produced. So I trust that in due time, I will see that. I think, reminding yourself that this business takes a very long time, especially if you're submitting to a feature contest, but having the confidence that if you're attracting strong producers, that this is something that they're focused and keen on. The Post was something that was featured on the Blacklist a few years ago, and to see that it is now in theaters is just a reminder to us that keep dreaming and submit and write, and you will attract the right people if you're telling a story that's urgent and timely. In the last 2 years, I've won 2 contests. Congrats, Chris. That's awesome. You've been a finalist in 3 and semi-finalist in 2 more, but you live 12,500 miles from Hollywood and have to market yourself from long distance. What would be your quick suggestion for a strategy? Funnily enough, about a third of my clients do not live in Los Angeles. And it's, one of them won the Sloan Grant a few years ago, which is a science-specific fund that the Tribeca Film Festival, in tandem with the Alfred Sloan Foundation, they kind of pair together and invite stories that innovate on they innovate storytelling for the math and sciences. The Imitation Game won that award also. And it was off of that script of just like reading it, loving it, and meeting the writer and understanding that this writer had a life in Indiana. That, you know, I'm not going to tell her to uproot her family to move to Los Angeles. But it was very much the strategy that we talked about was talking about what kind of projects does she want to work on and what stories does she want to tell. And so she's also a playwright. Her play writing career is flourishing in Chicago, and she's close to Chicago. But in the feature space, features can be written remotely. The one thing, Chris, I do recommend, though, is if in winning these contests you have formulated a couple of relationships with representatives and are able to get representation, that will be a great way for people to advocate for you. And additionally, keeping in mind that it's a good thing to come to Los Angeles to meet people and to network. Building out your network, even from far away, is going to be great for you in terms of having people be in your corner and being able to promote your work on your behalf. A lot of these success stories, and why I think, you know, you see speeches at the end of the Oscars and the Golden Globes, people are thanking their community who have helped them get them there. So just keeping those things in mind will help build out a strategy beyond just placing in contests. And how do you build off that momentum is just finding people in your corner that are based in LA or based in New York, and also figuring out, okay, what are things that you can do now to continue promoting your work? At what point in your career should you make the transition from a part-time writer to a full-time writer? In a practical world, that transition comes in the financial stability, because a full-time writer is someone who is, in my opinion, someone who is paying the bills off of the scripts that they are hired to write, or the scripts that they have sold, or whether they're in the room. That comes in hand in hand with your ability to go on general meetings and meeting people who are going to help get you to that point. There are several writers sort of in their early stages who I represent that are part-time writers, and it does take a little bit of time, but what I make sure of is that there's still a sense of relevancy and still a sense of them working toward that main goal of being a full-time writer. But I would never ask them to quit their jobs so that they can dedicate their whole, life to writing full-time, if it meant that they can't have a roof over their head. I also think that having a part-time job and sort of exposing yourself to different characters is a great way to just sort of help that invention in your brain for when it comes to storytelling. And sometimes it breaks writer's block. Okay, great. Follow up to price range question. I see a lot around the $35 to the $49 range. Are those considered low end and not worth wasting the time and money on? Or does that sound average? That sounds pretty average. I think just doing your homework though, right? If you're like, this feels low, it feels too good to be true, what's the catch? Do your homework, see whether, what that specific contest yields in terms of, is the prize at the end a trip to LA to meet a bunch of people? For $35, that sounds like a remarkable thing. If for $35 you get $100, but nothing that builds out your career, maybe it's something to be like, is this worth pursuing? So just considering in your head, what is your return on investment from your money? Because if for $35 you get guaranteed meetings with 5 people and a week in New York, granted, this is something that I'm conjuring up in my head, but I'm familiar with some contests that fly out their writers. I think that sounds really great. But if it's just something where it's you're just getting prize money but nothing to build out your career, I'm not sure how worth it is. Unless you really like money, then that's you. Would you recommend labs and fellowships over contests? Yes, I would. I think labs and fellowships are thinking into some degree about sort of nurturing a network and feeding into your niche. And there are so many contests out there that it is like, okay, you place, and now what? But the labs and the fellowships, at least the ones that I'm thinking of in my head, are servicing a specific need in the industry, and they're networking, and they exist for a very specific reason. And so it's just to help for, that specific type of writer. There's the, Sundance Labs for, writers of a specific descent, or even there's the fellowship that Meryl Streep sponsors that's for women over 65. And so it's really serving a specific purpose. So if you qualify, definitely consider it. But it's also going back to this major question that is sort of on theme for this, is like, why am I submitting to this? Contests are great for representation. Labs and fellowships, sometimes those writers already have representation. It's just an extension or an experience that they want to supplement their craft. So there we have it. What are the marks of a contest that we should absolutely stay away from? This goes back to the price range question of staying away from competitions that are like not going to service your career like as a whole. Like if it's a contest that is not connected to Hollywood, that the panelists, there's no transparency in who's reading your scripts, or where the feedback is coming from, or what the return on investment is, I would say that is a lot of red flags of being like, the greater question of, why am I submitting to this? Like, what am I getting from it? And is it just someone who's taking advantage of a writer? So just keep that in mind, because I think there are a lot of opportunists out there, and think, okay, you know what, this is something that writers just want exposure. So doing your homework and seeing like, okay, what are the success stories out of this? And do I want to be part of that group and sort of have those same bragging rights? This question of, they had you sign a release. Janine, if you could expand on this, that would be great, because, your question had two parts. How exactly does the block, okay, hold on. Sorry, I confused Janine and Melissa's questions. Apologies. So here, Melissa White, you asked, my question has two parts. Have you signed any contest winners or finalists as your clients? If not, how do you sign most of your clients? Through referrals or cold submissions? Also, what kinds of projects are looking for TV? Amazing. This is a more than two-parter, but I'll take it. Yes, I have signed writers off of contests, and funnily enough, they're not the finalists. They tend to be people who place like quarter finalists or semi-finalists, and it's also just because my taste is very specific and niche, so it's not necessarily like the most commercial or the top 10. But I also have a very specific strategy in terms of like what I'm thinking about when I'm signing a client, and thinking about, okay, how are they considering what their voice is. So that's something that, just a personal thing, but there are people that love, signing the people who placed number 1, number 2, number 3. So yes, I have signed them. It does not make up the majority of my client list. How I sign most of my clients, it really varies. Referrals are great. I really like it when someone who I've worked with, who's familiar with my taste, suggest someone to me. And the cold submissions, depending on the day and depending on the time, I will look at them, but it's a much longer process, because there's sort of tiers to which my reading list and my reading pile goes. It's always my clients first, then it's referrals, then it's project drafts or potential assignments that I need to read for the clients that are working. And then, at the bottom, when I have time, it's going to be the cold submissions. And what kind of projects am I looking for? TVs, features, which genres? I don't have an answer to that, because I'm looking for everything. I'm looking for people who are creators, who are storytellers at heart. They're writing for whatever medium. I've recently signed, people who are developing a web series, but the way in which they think I know can translate to film and television. My personal taste is like very varied, but it goes back to the idea of stories that are feeling sort of like fresh, a perspective I've never seen before, and stories that don't feel derivative. And so that can fall under any genre. How exactly does the blacklist work? Do you really need to be inside the industry to get listed there? So there are two components to the blacklist. One component is the blacklist, the list that we see at the end of the year. That is, 600. I think that's the number, but there are executives around town who the blacklist contacts to say, what were your favorite scripts of the year? And then those answers are submitted to them, and then they rank them by vote. So that's one component of the blacklist, which is sort of like the surveyed best scripts that have been written in the industry. And then the other part is their website. So you can, for a membership, submit your scripts online, get ratings. And I've signed clients who have submitted to the blacklist, and it's usually off of log lines, but there are producers who have memberships to the blacklist and read scripts for potential projects. And so oftentimes they'll read something by an unrepresented writer, and then that producer will contact me or one of my colleagues or people in the industry to say, this is a piece of material that I love that I think you will too. So that's sort of how it works. You don't have to be inside the industry to get listed in terms of a script that everyone reads. You don't have to be in the industry for people to love a script. But it is a matter of like making sure that you within your network are able to expose it to that many people. Can you make it on talent alone? What if you're not good in a room? So it's a very challenging question, because I will have to say that a writer, it is a social position. It is not just being a phenomenal writer, because really when you're writing a script and you're inviting a conversation, you're inviting a collaboration. So if you're not comfortable with people, then an industry like Hollywood, where if someone likes your script, you're inviting a producer into the conversation, and that producer wants to bring in a director and then an actor, and you're not comfortable in that dialogue, it just does not position you to have a creative say in it, or even that people would want to work with you. Sometimes you see writers who are they're okay, they're not the best talent, but they're incredible in a room and people love working with them because of their collaborative nature, and also because of their willingness to adjust. So oftentimes when I'm looking or reading a script that I'm judging for a contest, and the follow-up is a meeting. It's always a meeting. We want to meet with the writer to see what their expectations are, but also to see how they are in a room. Because if they're not comfortable in a room with a rep, then it's hard to see how that would translate to how that would be with other sort of people in the industry and other roles. So what contest would you suggest would be a good feedback resource without being very expensive for the screenwriter? Most contests judge a screenwriter's material, and depending on how much you're willing to pay will depend on how well the feedback will be. So I was not familiar with the concept of feedback being sort of like on a scale, and that if you pay more, you get more feedback. But I know that the feedback that you get from reputable contests are from people like for the Austin Film Festival and the Launchpad. Like those people are taking the time, and they're professional readers, and they're not just trying to like knock off, just trying to get through scripts and give a conventional answer. They're putting time and effort into it. But I would also ask yourself what you're seeking out from the feedback. If you want feedback as to why you're not getting representation from the script, like that seems like a very arbitrary answer, in terms of the feedback is not going to tell you why you're not further along in your career. But if you're like, this is a script that's a work in progress and I want feedback to make it better, then I would just figure out like the price that you're willing to pay for that. But if you're a writer with a community and a writers group, then there are people in your life who can provide you with feedback for free. So just things to think about. And if you don't have that community, I highly recommend to everyone that's participating in this webinar to build out your community, because those are the people who are going to be your advocates. When we were talking earlier about referrals and where I get my clients, having now been a manager for 3 years, I'm getting recommendations from other clients. And so it's great to meet writers who are working, who want to advocate up and coming writers. So it's just things to think about, because writers give great feedback if they are in your corner. So yeah. You say we should go to LA and network. I guess my question is, how do we do that? You mentioned before, I think, attending pitch festivals or film festivals, but is there something else that would explain how we might network? Where do we go to network if we don't go to competitions or festivals? Also, going to LA and networking, what I meant was, if you get invited by a contest, like if you place and they invite you, take that as an opportunity to network with other writers and with the people at the contest or the conference or whatever in your hometown, or if you live near a metropolitan city. There should be events for writers and writers groups that you can curate. Sometimes it takes you taking the initiative to invite fellow writers, or to, post on writer community blogs of, hey, like I'm looking just for a group of people to read my ideas and also for me to read yours. And it just becomes a very sort of symbiotic relationship. So that type of networking, it's just building out that community and people who share your sensibilities, because you never know who wants to participate in that. And also, if they end up getting further along in their career a little bit before you, if they can recommend you to their representative or producer, or just help kind of extend your own personal network. So beyond going to festivals and beyond participating in mixers, it's just thinking about like, how are ways of taking initiative to meet other writers, whether they're in my position or someone who's a bit further along, and just talking to them and networking in a capacity of just like developing friendships and developing working relationships with writers as a means of improving your craft, and also learning from other people's experiences of what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and how can you apply that to yourself. Oh, so you had to sign a release with, okay, Janine, thank you for answering your question. So you had to sign a release with the two producers, so I guess there are two circumstances. So the producers made you sign a release about not submitting to the festival, or the festival made you sign a release that you couldn't have your material optioned? If the festival asked you not to, or the contest asked you not to, in signing a release, get your material optioned, then in you submitting to that contest, you're agreeing to those terms, and you essentially have to tell those two producers, to wait. But if the producers are asking you to sign a release to not submit to contests, like you need to ask them then, what are you gaining by not exposing your material? So they agree to read your scripts as long as you sign the release, no contest involved. Oh, okay. My company requires people to sign releases because it's a form of protection. There's a lot of convergence that happens in our industry in terms of ideas. And so it's a form of protecting you and protecting the people who are reading your material, because, there's just a lot of, it's the liability of it, right? If you happen to be submitting a script that a client or a project is similar to, that it's the terms of, you're signing this release knowing that there's a possible coincidence and you don't have the positioning to say like that the idea was stolen, like you are protecting yourself in that, you're submitting this knowing this might happen. But it's just an agreement between two parties because you're submitting coldly. But I think it's very important to sign those releases. And if you're not comfortable signing them and you know a lawyer or can get an entertainment lawyer or someone to look over the paperwork, places like my company will accept material if it's coming from a representative. So if it's a lawyer that's sending it material on your behalf, then that's another protection in place as well. Okay, I mentioned that I have a specific taste. Can I please elaborate on what that is? So I didn't talk too much, Melody, about sort of like where I'm from and what I'm all about, but I'm Venezuelan. I grew up in Southeast Asia and I moved to the United States a little bit after 9/11. I've lived in Los Angeles for 5 years, and the common denominator in every single place that I've lived was that there was a movie theater and everyone had a TV in their house. And the reality was that storytelling and universal storytelling sort of like transcended any cultural boundary. But there's still things that are sort of nuanced for each culture. So having grown up Venezuelan and having been in Southeast Asia, I sort of adopted certain quirks, like my humor can be dry and like kind of dark, which I can't attribute to any culture. It's just a matter of like the amalgamation of all of that. So if someone wants to send me a very broad comedy script, I tend to warn them that my sense of humor is very specific and I can't describe it other than like, I will cackle sometimes at things that other people might not find funny. So it's that, but it's kind of like prize of something that's subjective. And, going beyond that when it comes to certain genres of the biopic or the drama or something that's period, it really is going to depend on what's the story that's being told in that world, because there's just certain things that don't appeal to me personally. Then again, I don't like to write off like certain like themes or certain worlds, because sometimes the writing is impeccable and I don't know it until I see it. So yeah, my taste is specific, but that's often why I pass on things, because it's like it is good writing, but it's just not something that I love. But that's not to say that someone else will love it. And, a few years ago, I was interning at a company and I was working for someone who admitted that they had passed on Black Swan when they read the script. And they were an intern when they read it. It's like an intern would read it, then an assistant would read it, then the executive would read it. And someone was like, man, I can't believe it. Like, that's like my biggest regret in my career. And I was like, that's not a regret. Like when you're reading the script, you don't know what you're going to get. And there was someone that read the script, loved it. And then, it took on its new form. So it's just those things of, you don't know it till you see it. And even if you see it and it's not yours, it doesn't completely, it doesn't become an absolute truth that it's abysmal or it's not worth it, Cool. Awesome. I mean, yeah, I think just really asking yourself what kind of stories do you like to tell and what's going to be a reflection of like who you are as a person. It's essential in that process as you're doing your research as to what festivals and contests, looking to writers, their careers, and thinking like, oh, this is a writer that I admire. How did they get their start? You'll be very surprised that it's not just nepotism, or it's not just like some miracle that happened. Success stories happen overnight over the course of 10 years. And so just looking back of like, when did this all start, is going to like inspire you and remind you that these writers that are currently working in Hollywood started in similar positions as yourself. We also live in an incredible day and age whereby Twitter is a resource, Facebook is a resource. And so when we were talking a little bit about networking and not physically being in a place, take advantage, like start to follow the writers that you admire on Twitter. And if you were comfortable, start a conversation with them, ask them a question. Usually they can be receptive. And, maybe that will build out a fruitful conversation. Um, I am a similar background as you, and I like to write about the global themes, but not sure Hollywood is ready for stories about people from other cultures. Do you find this true? Um, I don't agree with it just because there are incredible stories about other cultures that thrive in the United States because it's another perspective. In my head, I think about, The Hunt for the Wilder People, which is a New Zealand movie that Taika Waititi wrote and directed. And that is not my culture. And I actually never lived in New Zealand. And yet I can really identify with that narrative. And when that movie came out in the United States, it had a limited release, but they gave it more screens because of such the positive response. So I think the assumption that Hollywood is not ready for those stories, don't make that assumption. Submit to the contests, find people who have similar backstories as you, or even just like tell a remarkable story, and the cream rises to the top. And so regardless of what it might have cultural nuances, it might do very well. I also think that the same is true of British stories can travel, and some American stories travel well too. So we talk about the global box office and international stories, and there's movies that do great abroad that are so American specific. So why shouldn't the opposite be the same? Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. I appreciate the, you thanking me. Amazing.
How you feeling, Danielle? That was awesome.
Oh man, thank you. I feel good. I'm just thirsty, but
I'll go get
survive.
some water.
No, I think that everyone asked great questions, and I hope that it just, inspires and reminds them that, yes, there are people who read their scripts, and yes, that, success stories are real, but writing as a profession requires putting the work and effort, but having the faith that it will all pay off. So, yeah.
Awesome. I'm cutting off. Sorry, guys. I'm going to cut off we're sort of right at time. So I'm going to cut off the Q&A. That's why I popped in here. I apologize. Okay, you've also answered 100 questions. So I
answered 40. I could have done 50, but it's okay.
You could have done as many. You're right. You did answer 40. If there's any question in here that you see that you want to end on, you're more than welcome. But I also feel like we're pretty
I think that note, we ended on the right note. So all good stuff.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for attending. And thank you so much again, Danielle. It was great to meet you.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. Well, have a good one, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.